Welcome to the Culture Lab.
Welcome to the Culture Lab. I'm Kyla Ronellenfitsch.
And I'm Gabe Roche. This week in the lab, the data's back, the results are in.
Rivalry status.
Heated.
Backlash volume.
Surprisingly quiet.
Under the microscope today, our loaded question. How did Heated Rivalry deke the culture wars?
We dive into the data and speak with Justin Ling, renowned investigative journalist and expert on right-wing media.
We get into why, in an age of anti-wokery and rising social conservatism, the backlash we might have expected hasn't materialized.
Let's dig in.
But Gabe, we made it through our first episode, without, there hasn't been a cancellation in sight. We made it in the clear.
Yes.
Only one minor medical emergency. How are you feeling?
Ooh, I am doing all right. Listeners, hopefully this is not TMI, but as we were wrapping our podcast recording last week, I had a little incident with a kidney stone. And yeah, a word to the wise, do not podcast while stoned. But I passed that test.
You did. Now people will go back and watch the YouTube and just see, how much of a warrior you were, because it was, extremely subtle. And then suddenly we get a message from you after and it's like, oh boy, okay.
Watch for the wincing every once in a while. It wasn't because of any of the content, shall we say.
Right. Well, as they say, that's show business.
Show business, baby.
But speaking of, today's episode is about Heated Rivalry. This is really the true reason why I wanted to start a podcast, even though when we started musing about the podcast, it was like several months before Heated Rivalry was actually a thing. But I think it's all meant to be. It all came together.
Yeah, you had a premonition. I love it. Exactly.
But in case, any of our audience members have been living under a rock and don't know what Heated Rivalry is, it's a Canadian-produced TV show that blew up over the past few months. Some would say the shorthand for it has been that it's a show about gay hockey players, but they're missing the point. It's actually about straight women facilitating gay love.
I have not heard that take before, but very interesting. Okay, so is this just you openly campaigning for us to be the Will and Grace of the podcasting world?
It is. You know me, I love a clear brand identity. So let's put this in the rotation, see how it fits.
Okay, well, auditions then are still open for Culture Lab's very own Jack and Karen. Folks can apply in the comments, I guess. So be nice.
Absolutely. But you have to get that registered, right? To be a Karen is that high pitched, I don't even know how to describe it.
Oh, iconic.
But did you watch Heated Rivalry? I guess you must have if we were going to do a whole episode about it. What was your review?
I did. I'm in California at the moment, so I watched it on HBO Max. So I was helping to build out some of those global audience numbers. We're going to talk about that a bit later. I initially kind of resisted for a couple days, but then, of course, I got right into it. I actually watched the finale when I was home for Christmas at my parents' house, and maybe should have had a bit.
It's a risky move.
Should have had a bit more privacy. Look, I admit I've never really had hockey fantasies.
Say more. Okay, well, we're going there.
Just too stinky.
Fair, yeah.
I've been in a hockey arena once or twice, but I can see the appeal after this show. It's good marketing for hockey players, and my TikTok algorithm kind of lit up with girls going on field trips to local hockey rinks, and they were calling them the boy aquarium, which
yes.
that was very funny. What about you?
Yeah, I actually watched it the day that it came out, but I not really with intention. I didn't know. Obviously, I intended to watch it, but I'd never heard of the books or the show. So I was just kind of scrolling through Crave and saw, oh, cool, gay hockey players. Let's see what this is about. And I didn't know that I was entering a cult. Like I feel like I was on the ground level. I'm now, the head of my own line of a pyramid scheme.
Yes.
I have recruited so many people to watch it. And you know what though? Like, Ottawa winters are long. A cult is there. There are worse ways to pass your time.
Sure, absolutely.
But I'm sure that we could talk about reviews forever. But this is a political podcast, so why are we talking about it?
I think Culture Lab's raison d'etre is looking at the ways in which politics is kind of downstream of culture. Nothing exists in a vacuum. Art, popular culture reflects and I think moves us forward in who we are as people, and also kind of shines a spotlight on what we value. In tangible political terms, it helps to shape the kinds of candidates that appeal, influences the issue set, the appetite for policy change, and shapes, frankly, like the overall language that we use in politics and some of the tactics that we use in persuasion. Of course, all of this can happen in reverse because backlash is just as powerful a political and organizing force. But given the content and the scale of its success, Heated Rivalry, I think, is a perfect political case study.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm here. I agree. I'm really excited to dig into the political side of this. So now's the part of the podcast where we really, we bombard you all with numbers. So hold on. But to give a sense of sort of the scale of the success of Heated Rivalry, within its first 3 weeks, Crave viewership increased by 400%.
Wild.
1/3 of audience members have rewatched an episode, and 15% have watched an episode 5 times or more.
Oh my God. Wellness check.
Yeah, they call it reheating an episode.
Okay.
If you look at Google Trends, this show has generated the greatest interest of a Canadian show by far, like more than double Schitt's Creek at its peak. And that's, season 1 for a show that people had not really heard about before, that didn't have a Eugene Levy or a Dan Levy to help carry it. Like, it is really incredible how much of an impact it's had in Canada.
And so in Canada is one thing, but around the world, Heated Rivalry is the number 2 driver of first-time viewers to HBO Max. It's kind of crazy. 10.6 million Americans have watched the show. It's by far the most successful Canadian-produced show, and the most successful acquired show that HBO didn't produce itself. Just to give you a sense of the audience numbers, like, it's more popular than the first season of White Lotus. It's a global phenomenon. One of my favorite stories about the show's success is its popularity in Russia, where, of course, it's banned under Russia's really odious laws against spreading, quote, gay propaganda, unquote. But it's become this kind of underground phenomenon. The main Heated Rivalry Telegram channel, for example, has 45,000 members. This is something that's illegal. It's got 8.6 on Russia's version of IMDb, and LGBTQ Russians figuring out kind of extra legal ways to download or watch the show. They're finding resonance and representation, especially in the Ilya character. I find that kind of a heartwarming and hopeful anecdote in a dark time for gay Russians.
Absolutely. I was, very stunned by those numbers. And, going back to the impact in Canada or among the Canadian audience, I had done some polling on this a little earlier this year, really perfecting my niche in the Heated Rivalry political space. But in that polling, I found that 7 in 10 viewers say that the show makes them more proud to be Canadian. So really, that is the version of this year-long kind of journey that we've been on of a resurgence of Canadian pride. Like, this is a stop along that for the people that watch the show.
Beautiful.
I also found that 2/3 of people who watched the show thought that it was a good use of taxpayer money. If you pay attention to anything that the government spends money on, a lot of things don't necessarily achieve 64% approval. And
Yeah.
it also increased, 64% said that it made them more interested in hockey, which shows up in the real numbers. NHL weekly tickets are up 20% compared to last year. It's just absolutely incredible, the both real world consequence and then just in people's minds.
Yeah, and we've seen some collision with politics, right? A few weeks ago, there was this spectacular collision. Martina Stevens-Gridneff of the New York Times Canada bureau chief said that, quote, between Carney's Davos speech and heated rivalry, Canadian soft power is at historic highs. Okay, so these are the two. The Davos speech.
Yeah.
I'm not going to say high
historic
and low
speech.
because it's not lowbrow entertainment. But yeah, I mean, if those are the two things the New York Times are putting in the window. But look, on the heels of the Davos speech, Prime Minister Carney spoke at the Canadian Media Producers Association Gala in Ottawa. He cheekily took credit for funding and greenlighting the show. And the Prime Minister's clip of that speech has a couple 100,000 views on X, on his account alone. So, I mean, it's like a top performing post. A single photo of him and Hudson Williams doing the leg thing has more than 2 million views. The video on the main Hudson Williams fan account, which I don't follow, but it appeared in my algorithm.
Just happened to cross it.
Has another 200,000 views. On TikTok, I counted more than 1 million likes. So that's just likes, not even views. And more than 5 million views on Instagram. And this is not just like fan content. This is, the Prime Minister and Hudson Williams doing the leg thing on the red carpet. So massive numbers.
Which, to
views.
clarify, is basically, I don't know, what do we call it? Like a half straddle? Like he had his leg up draped over the Prime Minister.
Yeah.
Yeah. But, this is important, not as some type of political stunt, but because it's the kind of event that actually, as you were saying in those numbers, that actually breaks through, especially among young Canadians and people who spend a lot of time online. So most young Canadians, honestly, they just don't really consume information about the news, especially, Canadian news can be hard to come by in our algorithms. Just 1 in 10 say that they read newspapers or watch cable news, and instead, of course, they're on social media. But only a quarter of young people say that their algorithms regularly feed them information about politics. So what they're seeing and what our politicians and our news content is competing against is that scroll of like celebrity news and then a cooking video and then, I don't know, a video about dogs or videos about gaming, all of that kind of stuff. And so this is the kind of thing that breaks through in that information environment. And I describe it as basically like hiding the pill in the cheese, to go back to my dog mom isms, but basically putting political messaging in entertainment. Like what people would have learned from this is, the Prime Minister can engage with content about same-sex relationships in a way that is like funny and I think broadly viewed as kind of endearing, and that would be an important, I would say, data point for this younger audience.
Absolutely. And nonetheless, in all this commotion, what's been surprising to me, and I think to you, is what hasn't happened. There have been a few instances of criticism. There's a conservative YouTuber who titled her video, quote, "Watching gay porn is the new social justice warrior fetish," end quote. But we haven't seen a sustained meltdown or really the kind of backlash you might expect over the show and its content.
Yeah, and if you aren't, a close watcher of the culture wars, you might think, why would there be? It's 2026. Maybe we've evolved past this. We have bigger fish to fry. But we have a list of some of the events that has gotten right-wing media their jocks in a bind. So the first is, casting a black Little Mermaid.
Yes, a no longer sexy green M&M.
For shame.
Bud
Light partnering
the candy, not the white wrapper.
Right. Yes. A high heeled M&M cartoon. Bud Light partnering with a transgender influencer.
gas stoves.
Target's Pride collection.
And look, on same-sex marriage, support in the U.S. is actually going down. The high watermark was around 2021, 70% support amongst Americans, reported by Gallup. 2023, that number's down to 63% from a study by Pew. And in 2025, YouGov and The Economist had support at just 54%. Among Republicans, of course, that number's a lot lower. Also, 2025, Gallup had Republicans at 41% support compared to, high 80s among Democrats. And that they said that's the lowest they've measured since 2016, right after the Obergefell decision. So, of course, so many of our culture wars in Canada are seeded by right-wing media in the US. But why not this kind of backlash from Heated Rivalry? Was it something about the show itself? Was it success? Too much of a slow burn or kind of under the radar because it's Canadian?
Important question. Has the gay agenda won? Are the culture warriors now only preoccupied with the T in LGBTQ? Have they kind of, given up on caring about or deeply caring about same-sex relationships?
Right. Or between arresting Maduro, invading Minneapolis, threatening to annex Greenland, and just otherwise flooding the zone with shit, were they just too busy?
And before the comment section starts firing up, yes, we know that cultural blowups are also lit by leftists. As a longtime online Swiftie, I had to live through is Taylor Swift a trad wife eugenicist because she sung about wanting to have kids with her fiance? So, stupidity is kind of a bipartisan effort. But today, we're talking. I'm really excited to be talking about the right wing information ecosystem with our very esteemed guest Justin Ling. So I can't wait to unpack our loaded question with him.
I'm really excited to dig into our loaded question this week. How did Heated Rivalry deke the culture wars with Justin Ling? Justin is an investigative journalist and staff columnist at the Toronto Star. He writes about national security, foreign policy, tech, politics, and information warfare. He also publishes the must-read Substack, Bug-Eyed and Shameless.
Justin, welcome to the show. We're so happy to have you and someone as esteemed as yourself to talk about hockey smut.
Thanks for having me.
So, Justin, I want to start with the obvious question. Did you watch Heated Rivalry?
Yeah, of course. I was a little bit late to the party. I was definitely at that point where I was like, I feel like the zeitgeist has passed me by. Do I just skip it? But then I of course eventually watched it, and it was fantastic, and I loved it. And how could you not?
Awesome. So one of the things we want to do on the podcast today is spend a little bit of time talking about the backlash. From what I saw, the backlash came mostly from the left, the kind of the woke keyboard warriors, if you will. Lots of questions about the actor's sexuality, whether, if the actors aren't gay. I don't know that it's been confirmed either way. Do they have the right to play these characters? If straight women should be writing stories like this. That was sort of the extent of the backlash that I saw. The right, where we might have expected some backlash, was pretty silent. I've not seen much. What did you make of the reaction?
Oh, yeah, I wasn't surprised at all. I didn't expect any backlash from the right. And I think, frankly, the kind of programming we have to expect that, I think really shows how little we understand the current information ecosystem, right? So we can take, the left-wing backlash such as it was in a minute, but the lack of sort of right-wing or far-right or extremist or what a fundamentalist, let's say, response to it, I don't think is surprising at all, because it's suggesting that they would. I think assumes that they're just sort of offended and angry and that they swing at every pitch, and they don't. Like, that has not been their strategy. Kind of going back in the last 5, let's say 10 years, generally the right has been really good at exposing cleavages, things that are not universally popular, things that are not, super well appreciated or in, the cultural milieu that everyone kind of swims in. What they're really good at is picking up on obscure things that are controversial, things that do make people squirm a little bit. They're really good at figuring out where there's already sort of a rage or discomfort or whatever being ginned up, and then really leading into it and exploiting it and turning it into one of those things where you're either red-pilled or blue-pilled. There's really no red pill or blue pill to be had with Heated Rivalry. You just sort of enjoyed it, or if you were sort of put off by, the sex scenes, you didn't watch it, right? Like, I don't see any opening there for them to take advantage of it. And if anything, I think this is actually one of those circumstances where right-wing figures got to actually enjoy it and play in this space and show that they're not stodgy or totally reactionary. They actually got to participate a little bit in the cultural conversation about it and show, like, hey, we're not your father's far right party. We like Heated Rivalry too. So I really am not surprised at all. And when you first asked me about this conversation, I actually kind of was bewildered because it hadn't really even struck me in some time that there would be a right-wing backlash, because they do not, like I said, swing at every pitch, and there's, or I guess, slap shot at every puck. I don't know what the hockey equivalent of that metaphor is.
We're a bunch of good Canadians on this podcast. Our hockey expertise is at a 10. Too. Yeah. That's really interesting, because I think when I was watching it, I wasn't like, oh, this is coming, absolutely there's going to be a backlash, but there is kind of, for me, there was just that tinge of like, we'll see kind of what happens. Like, it does. But again, I definitely do not pay as close of attention to this. It's just sort of like a background chatter that I go through, or that I see. So I'm curious, maybe let's just start at, a super ground level. I think all of us live in kind of our own algorithms. I think it's entirely possible to spend your life without being familiar with right-wing media and figures at all. Like, I know when Charlie Kirk was assassinated, I had a lot of people in my life coming up and being like, I'd never heard of this person, and were very surprised by the reaction. So can you give us kind of a lay of the land of, like, how do you categorize the different voices on the right? Like, how do you kind of think of them into different groupings? Can you give us that look?
Yeah, this is actually a much more complicated question, even going back just over a year ago, because there were all these countervailing and sometimes warring factions of different groups, some of them sort of established, some of them sort of fringe. You had conspiracist movements like QAnon, and then you had the more kind of establishment Republican, like Stop the Steal movement, for example. You had kind of established corporate media enterprises like the Daily Wire, which is associated with Ben Shapiro and some others. And you had kind of more grassroots-y defined groups like Turning Point USA, which was Charlie Kirk's organization. And there was really no kind of central space for all of this. Obviously, a lot of this was orchestrated around Donald Trump, but it wasn't universally so. And, in Canada, it gets a little more complicated because you don't really have that same central figure, and it gets even weirder into Europe and Australia and elsewhere. So sort of all disparate. And then obviously Donald Trump gets reelected, and things change to some degree, because there is now this sort of rallying around the leader. Now that he's proven that he can actually regain, national office, there was this moment of, okay, do we want to be in the White House press pool? Do we want to be staffers? Dan Bongino, for example, the radio host who took over Rush Limbaugh's show, who was, kind of a middling figure, I suppose, in the right-wing media information space, went on to become deputy director of the FBI. The director was a QAnon truther named Kash Patel. So, there was all of this weird reordering of the information space around Trump's victory, and where we kind of wind up into late 2025 is not a lot of diversity. It is really kind of the Trump show all the time. And there's a couple of dissenting voices. You have Candace Owens, who's kind of constantly at war with her own side for kind of sometimes perplexing reasons. You have some of the Groypers and Nick Fuentes, who are the more neo-Nazi hard right element to this movement, but a lot of it really still is this mega space. So determining kind of what becomes controversial, what becomes viral, what becomes the narrative, what becomes a conspiracy theory, really does often get determined in the spaces where they all kind of swim, and increasingly that's Elon Musk's Twitter, which is now the kind of the incubator for narratives, although not universally.
Right. I think, especially in the last presidential election, like a lot was made of the president being on Joe Rogan's podcast and just general kind of. I don't know. It depends who you are. Hysteria about the manosphere, or concern or support, or, whatever. There's obviously a full range. But how do you find these people that are like not necessarily? I think what they're doing is political, but they're not really political figures. Like, how do you situate them in this landscape?
Metaphors are sometimes so useless when it comes to the internet, because we're talking about such a big and kind of unfathomably huge thing that, using these metaphors are always just completely ill-equipped. So landscape, I like ecosystem because it suggests that there's sort of a food chain, and that there's, different elements to this kind of symbiosis of what creates this fertile space for these information narratives. But that's not great either. These are all kind of bad. But suffice to say, the world in which we live in now is not so much one where there's a single narrative that gets promulgated out and then gets adopted and then gets spread. We're now in just a million different conversations all happening at the same time. And there are people, and to some degree journalists are this too, politicians are this too, but particularly really effective kind of information warriors around Donald Trump are experts at this. They're watching these million conversations go on at the same time, and they're figuring out what has kind of viral potentiality. And they pick stuff out, and they adopt it, and they refashion it, and they workshop it with their followers, and then they kind of weaponize it on a grand scale. And we still have not, as humans, fully adapted our brains to this process, because we have never in the history of our species had to deal with this much information that comes at us this fast. At the same time, we know that the platforms through which we get this information have done a bunch of things that are making us completely insane, right? Like, we have internal emails from Facebook, including some other emails and internal memos from TikTok, that basically acknowledge that the things they're doing to their algorithm, the decisions they make on how to reward content and not reward it, is prioritizing rage, conspiratorial thinking, far-right parties, but in particular, it's encouraging far-right parties to get more aggressive and angry, and that it's creating social media addiction. Like, I'm just looking at some data that suggests that huge amounts of the American population spend more than 5 hours a day on social media. That is a terrifying number. So when we're talking about this information landscape, this ecosystem, whatever you want to call it, we kind of have to reckon with the fact that we are addicted, that we are being manipulated by the platforms we use, and that we are being led by people who are obsessively following what we do and tailoring their message to us to encourage us to wind up at a very particular political and social position. That might sound kind of obvious, but the more you think about it, the more you realize that this is really uncharted territory. Like, we have never as a society done this before.
I was just going to say, I think that point is incredibly interesting. And just as a message, like, what Gabe and I do, obviously, is figure out, like, how do we communicate about things? How do we get people to shift behavior? All of those kinds of things. And the message that, like, actually, you're kind of a victim here. You are also part of the system. You are also the customer. You are all of these things, right? You are the data. Like, it is not necessarily, no one wants to think of themselves in those terms, right? No one wants to think like, I've been duped, or I am, like, when you look at rates of self-reported seeing misinformation, like, it's very low. I had seen a presentation on healthcare misinformation recently, and it's just like, that's not the reality. Like, people are seeing it, they just don't identify it as such.
That's interesting because there's a little bit of data to suggest the opposite. It kind of depends how you measure it. There's this really interesting study, I think it was 2024, maybe it was last year, that basically showed users real news and then misinformation, and asked them to categorize them as such. And what it found was that basically everybody, including those who were kind of coded right wing and who were susceptible to misinformation, kind of identified by these researchers, were actually just as likely, or more or less just as likely, to identify misinformation as such as the kind of control group. But what they found was really interesting was that if that misinformation provoked an emotional response, particularly rage, they were somewhere between 30 to 60% more likely to share it. That is really interesting. It basically suggests that people know stuff is false, but they share it anyway. Things become kind of more true than reality. They so believe in the lies that they want to encourage other people to believe it. And there's a secondary effect to this, which is that other researchers have found the single greatest predictor as to whether or not someone believes misinformation on social media is who shared it. So you have people sharing stuff they know isn't true because it feels true, and then other people believing it because they trust the source where it's coming from, even though that person knows it's not true. That is just psychologically very messy. Now, here's the other part of this. When you kind of zoom in on that, it does kind of suggest to you that the problem really is not bad information. It's motivated reasoning to believe in bad information. And there's something to be said about the fact that comes out of people wanting to belong to movements where people lie to each other. They want to belong to movements where there's a truth kind of more true than reality, right? And then, that is Donald Trump's movement to a T. That is, I'm helping the working class by tariffing Canadian goods, or it's the 2020 election was stolen from you and patriots actually did the right thing, or it's, the people who showed up for January 6th were all, pleasant, wonderful people, whatever, right? There's an in-group kind of belonging element to believing this stuff that is quite unnerving. And there's something to be said about the fact, and I'll just stop here for a second, but I'll throw this at you. Heated Rivalry is one of those rare moments we've had as a non-crazy, non-political culture where we've all been in the same conversation and we've had a really good time with it, which I think is a really interesting reminder that we don't have to be angry and crazy all the time. We actually can just enjoy something.
I like that is a positive take. I like that. I wanted to ask, given the sort of uncharted territory that you've, I think, started to chart out for us a little bit. In your answer to my first question, you talked about this tendency of culture warriors to glom onto a fringe issue that they can then elevate and polarize around. Do you have a mental model of what fringe issues are particularly ripe for the picking?
Yeah, I do, and I think LGBTQ issues are a really good example. I mean, if you think back to 2016, even to Trump's 2020 campaign, he actually positioned himself as probably the most LGBTQ friendly Republican candidate to ever seek high office, right? Like, there was a gays for Trump movement, right? Like, there were Milo Yiannopoulos, who's this just unbelievably annoying charlatan of an influencer, started this whole narrative of, Trump is actually more pro-gay than the Democratic Party. And by and large, they actually tried to stay away from conversations around whether it's gay marriage or trans issues, in part knowing that there was a kind of a relative national unity on those questions, at least for that one moment in time. But then what happened? You started seeing, mostly through the alternative kind of right-wing press, this slight kind of chipping away at the consensus on this, and that there was increasingly these stories, and some of them are kind of, examples that are kind of worth litigating, but these examples of young people undergoing gender confirmation procedures and regretting it, or examples of doctors, maybe not doing their due diligence. And there's isolated kind of small cases, but they got strung together to tell a story. And the story became that the medical system and big pharma and the LGBTQ lobby and the gay agenda and all this were conspiring to trans your kids, right? Like, this is a narrative that Donald Trump was repeating yesterday at this, or whenever you're listening to this, but repeating just recently at the State of the Union address. He actually held up a young girl who he said was sort of duped and kind of kidnapped by the gender industry to turn her trans. And so that is very far aflung from where we started with Donald Trump, but it was meticulously built up by people who are cobbling together isolated instances, misrepresenting statistics, making stuff up in some cases, fashioning misinformation, and it goes into this larger narrative of they're lying to you, and it touches on the pandemic paranoia of big pharma and the public health lobby and doctors and media covering up bad science to protect their pals. And in that way, everything kind of fits together and becomes self-reinforcing, right? If you believe in, this gender panic, you're probably more likely to believe in panic around COVID-19 vaccines. If you believe in the panic around COVID-19 vaccines, you're more likely, weirdly enough, to think that, Russia is the victim in their own war against Ukraine. Like, there's all of these interlinking ideas that have no obvious connection, except they all sort of percolate in spaces where this misinformation, these conspiracy theories thrive, and where they're weaponized by bad actors to be connected and interlinked into this broader meta-narrative about, the evil deep state and the patriots who are trying to bring it down.
To zoom in a bit on the sort of first example you gave about Trump being a pro-gay president. And then the latest campaign, of course, you had J.D. Vance and people like Rick Ronell using this phrase, the normal gay guys.
Yeah.
Versus, I guess,
the LGBs, no T's or Q's.
Yeah. And so there's an attempt to wedge the LGBTQ community here. You've seen, prominent people like Andrew Sullivan, who's, I think, been part of this wedge. The LGB, not T and Q, is it a caricature of the right to say that they're more comfortable with gay men now, and it's the T's and the Q's that they are on the attack against, or is there something I'm missing about the right's relationship with gay guys, be they normal or otherwise?
No, there's definitely an element of that, and it's been true for quite some time. And I mean, Donald Trump is a pretty good example of this. I mean, his political mentor was Roy Cohn, a horrible, horrible man who worked for Nixon and I think Reagan, who was a self-loathing gay man. And there has been people around him who have been, gay and queer, and in some cases even trans, and who, through his incredible ability to make people feel valued in his movement, even as he attacks their community and people like them, he has brought together this weird rainbow coalition of, in some cases, people who are helping enable a full-scale national attack on their own community. And that is an interesting thing onto itself. But you also have to kind of recognize that the right did not start out playing these culture war games. I mean, the left did. And they're kind of borrowing some of these tactics, obviously for much more nefarious ends. But they're borrowing a lot of the sort of divide and conquer and identity politics, tactics that the left got really good at and that progressives use for many years. I mean, we started the conversation talking about a little bit about the left beating up on Heated Rivalry because maybe the actors aren't actually gay, and we have to out them to figure out if they are.
Yeah, right.
or maybe there's not enough black or indigenous representation of the show, or there's not enough women, or whatever. To some degree, this constant needs to go online to force people to pick sides, to dig at everything. and to create movements of people who kind of define themselves by this criticism and who egg each other on into this momentum building effort to call out and denounce stuff that doesn't kind of align with their political worldview. That's what the Republicans have been doing. And I mean, again, it's not a one-to-one. I'm not here saying that everyone who's criticizing Heated Rivalry for lacking Indigenous representation is exactly the same as Donald Trump. Of course, that's not what I'm saying. But I am saying that these online spaces, which encourage these petty and divisive and fundamentally and often stupid arguments, I think really is something the Republican movement has figured out quite well. There's obviously a lot of great ways to have thoughtful and nuanced conversations about these things, but when they're boiled down to tweets and when they very quickly descend into, you're an asshole, go kill yourself, which is always where these conversations go to, then I think it's fair to say that is a divisive thing that makes us less likely to actually engage in real conversation, less likely to agree, less likely to enjoy things. And I think, again, the fact that the Heated Rivalry discourse ended up pushing aside a lot of this annoying banter and just focusing on enjoying a show that everyone seems to clearly very much like, I think is an example that we are, maybe in a minor way, trying to escape the matrix of this perpetual rage machine.
Yeah, I think it's been very interesting to see some of the online discourse be like when people have engaged, there's almost a policing of the policing that's happening, which is like, this is why we lose. You guys are so fucking annoying. Yes. And that kind of feeling. Yeah.
Like by all means, like if you really want to make this argument, go write an 800 word essay as to, where you think Heated Rivalry has failed. That I think that's probably fine, but it's the constant sort of scalding hot takes and the TikToks and the responses to the TikToks and the very high velocity, low effort faux conversation that happens. That's what bugs me, right? Certain things need to be taken offline. Certain things need to be in a group chat, maybe, but more realistically with your friends at the cafe or at the bar. It's fine to have these opinions, but not everything has to be a national discourse. And again, this sort of shunting of all of our social discourse and conversations and politics onto the internet, where it gets exploited and twisted and distorted, makes us crazy. I just can't keep stressing this enough. We have so much data that suggests that this is not healthy, that this makes us less likely to trust each other and have real conversations. It makes us less likely to come to sort of consensus or thoughtful kind of political conclusions. And yet we seem to be doubling down on it at a time when we seem to have a lot of proof that we should be pulling back as quickly and as rapidly as possible.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have now also so much data on the unfortunate part is a lot of people don't have those structures in place. Like they don't have friends and they are not going to coffee shops and they're doing all of those things. One thing I really want to talk about, I think an obvious explanation for, aside from, okay, maybe the topic itself is not salient enough. I think you could also imagine this is also like a small Canadian production, and so maybe it slipped by under the radar in that way. But Canada has been no stranger to being a character in, I'm thinking of American, right-wing discourse, and being a character in the culture wars. Like I think of, Fox sending journalists to cover the convoy, or a lot of the content about the ostrich call in BC, and then just staying again on our theme, some of the reaction to the men's Olympic game on Sunday has been likening this to I'm showing my hockey knowledge, but likening this to a victory over communism, basically. Sure. that this is beating the right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But how would you describe Canada as kind of a character in the American culture wars?
There's a really interesting thing, and I almost wonder if this, because I think a lot about escaping the matrix these days. Like, how do we, and I'm borrowing a right-wing trope here, but how do we take the red pill and escape this crazy inducing online high velocity rage machine? What happens to make us do that? Certainly some of the stuff I just described and the frustration and maybe with how this discourse permeates and maybe it's finding that when you show up to the bar for Heated Rivalry trivia night that you're actually having a lot of fun and you make new friends and you don't have to spend so much damn time online. Maybe it's some of that. But one element of it too is that when you become a target of misinformation trends, you start to realize just how insane they truly are. The average person interacts with online misinformation, conspiracy theories in a very kind of perfunctory way. They might read a news article about Donald Trump saying or doing something insane. They might be horrified to see somebody who has fallen for these misinformation or conspiracy theories commit an act of violence. They might see some of their friends or their crazy uncle sharing it on Facebook. Fine, but that is a very sort of removed relationship with what is a trend that captures entire people's lives. Once you become the target of one of those things, you start to go, oh, this is so much worse than I ever could have possibly imagined. And you'll never know when you might wind up being one of those people. I mean, there are people on Twitter who, whenever there's a mass shooting, go and find images of innocent people and post them online, sometimes intentionally, sometimes mistakenly. And that person who they tag just gets inundated with suddenly thousands, tens of thousands of hate messages and death threats, and sometimes the cops show up at their door and they get swarmed, and a whole bunch of other stuff. There are instances where companies get accused of just ludicrous things that they have no involvement in. Think of Dominion Voting Systems, this Toronto company that made election machines for the U.S. government that was accused by Donald Trump and others of conspiring with China and North Korea and a whole bunch of others to rig the 2020 election. They had to start launching these huge lawsuits. They ended up, I think, kind of getting bought out and kind of winding down their Canadian business to some degree, because I think the never-ending deluge of nonsense they got was too much to handle. I think there is a growing movement of people who find themselves in the crosshairs of this stuff, who think, wow, I'm now realizing how bad it is. There are nations in Europe that have been experiencing this for quite some time, right? When Donald Trump, rambles on about there being no-go zones in Paris where hordes of marauding Muslims are, throwing people into the sea and beheading people in the streets, or whatever he imagines in his brain, when you live in Paris and you see those things, you go, well, that's not true. Maybe I can't trust everything that is on the internet. And to some degree, Canada, I think, is experiencing the same thing when we're sitting here and going, what are you talking about? Like, what are you on about? Accusing us of flooding the country with fentanyl or dumping a whole bunch of illegal aliens or whatever into the country, accusing us of taking advantage of the U.S. All of this stuff, I think the more you hear it, the more it forces you to sit up and go, wow, this sucks. Like, how do we keep participating in a system that seems to encourage these lies about our country?
Yeah, I think one observation that I had in the last federal election is, I think we've seen, obviously, conspiracy theories take off and really flourish in Canada as well. Like, this wasn't necessarily the most widespread, but these things kind of never are to a certain extent. It's like if we think of the World Economic Forum. Yeah. But I remember partway through the campaign asking a question in a survey that I was doing, asking people what they perceived as a greater threat to Canada, like kind of a description of the World Economic Forum versus Donald Trump. And I think that real world threats or mainstream perceived threats also sort of hold up a counterpoint to some of these things. Like it creates a hierarchy of concerns, and then maybe some of these smaller things just lose salience.
There's a thing I always say, which is, belief in conspiracy theories is a luxury of comfort, right? Like, you get to sit around all day and engage in misinformation and read these conspiracy narratives and go down the rabbit hole of these TikToks that claim that Titanic didn't sink because you have a bunch of free time, right? And that you don't really have clearly serious real problems. Now, there's a subset of people for whom, they're spending every waking moment, whether not working, their low-paying job and whose lives are tough, and this is an escapism for them. That's kind of one small subset. But for most people who engage in these conspiracy theories, they have normal jobs, they have families, they have stuff going for them, and they have no real threats to their lives, and therefore it's fun to cosplay in a world where there's dark, shadowy forces and where they can be part of a band of patriots who are fighting for freedom and democracy, mostly by posting online, right? Like that is just a simple truth about who are the sort of the hoplites of this conspiracy movement, and it's not as, and that's just one form of online entertainment. Of course, there's a whole bunch of other people who spend every waking moment obsessing with true crime, and there's other people who spend their time arguing about video games. This, to some degree, is a hobby for people, but it has very dangerous real world effects. And you know what people, what nation really does not have a lot of time for conspiracy theories and misinformation? Ukraine. I mean, here's an example of a country that is being visited upon endlessly and relentlessly with disinformation, conspiracy narratives, with psychological and information warfare, and it's not working. Because there's no time for luxury. there's no ability to sit around and say, oh, Klaus Schwab is the one who's really running this war, when you can see the missiles coming towards your city, right? So I really do think, and actually, I should say, I think you're totally right in that Canada is also a great example of a country that has sort of shaken itself out of a lot of these conspiracy theories. We still have, a misinformation problem. We still have people in this country who believe, I think quite silly things, but also faced with an existential economic and potentially sovereignty threat from our closest neighbor. People have really woken up and have gotten serious about these things. And I think that's a really good sign. And I'll just say finally, it would also be nice if these conspiracy theories remained a hobby and that they weren't being used or tipped towards by politicians who claim to be quite serious, right? There are a whole bunch of conspiracy theories and misinformation out there that does not matter if people believe them, right? Mm-hmm. Like, it doesn't really matter if you think the CIA killed JFK. That's kind of a niche belief that you're free to have. If you think the moon landing was faked, fine. If you think the world is flat, all right, I guess you're not taking any, long distance cruises. Whatever. It doesn't really matter if you believe those things. What matters is when those beliefs start connecting to politics, that politicians start refashioning, their own policies, communications, and practices to suit you, and it becomes this kind of positive feedback loop of people behaving increasingly irrational in order to sustain this conspiracy movement that claims things that just simply aren't true.
So can I pick up from there? We've talked about Canada as a character in the culture wars. We've talked about maybe Canada not having as much time for them as we might otherwise have. But on this question of political effects, I mean, the culture wars in Canada are kind of originating from Canada. Do you see a sort of prevalent, obviously it's not going to be the same scale as the US, but is there a prevalence of these kinds of conspiratorial thinking, conspiracy theories originating from Canada? And what would you say are the kind of downstream political effects of that?
Yeah, I've always said Canada is a net exporter of misinformation. We have some really top shelf, conspiracy influencers in this country. You look at like Ezra Levant and Rebel News. You look at something like Juno News, which has been beating the drum of this denialism of the horrors of residential schools, which is a very uniquely Canadian thing. You have some misinformation peddling around medical assistance in dying that has translated to the U.S. Mm-hmm. A lot of the World Economic Forum, the anti-vax stuff, comes from kind of Canadian sources. So we're very good at fashioning these things. And frankly, there's an interesting interplay there between, Canada being a relatively, at least until recently, a relatively high trust society. There's a lot of opening there for bad actors to come in and kind of misrepresent that high degree of trust and faith in big institutions as a conspiracy to defraud or to trick or dupe people. I think there's an interesting thing there that I still don't know the full kind of breadth of. But suffice to say, we also, I should say, in this country have had culture wars for a really long time. And what's interesting to me is how those culture wars got resolved previously in a way they're no longer getting resolved. Because to some degree, belief in misinformation and conspiracy theories and political polarization is the consequence of disagreements not getting resolved, right? I think this is something really important to fixate on. is that when, I think a lot of people assume that misinformation or conspiracy theories are just things created by bad actors and then imposed on people, but that's not how it works. It's a thing we do to each other. It is a collaborative effort we do to piece together grievances and annoyances and problems and then fashion them into a story that we like telling to each other, often with kind of bad consequences. But, we're a country built that pitted against Catholics and Protestants, English and French, East and West, urban and rural. You go down the list, Anglo-Franco, obviously. And we have never done a perfect job of figuring out those things, but we've done a pretty good job, I think, of disentangling all of that and trying to come to a consensus without, ripping each other's eyeballs out. Why is it now that we seemed, or at least up until quite recently, until this, national, this crisis of America was imposed on us, we seem to get quite bad at resolving those things. It's part of the reason why there is this big breaking down where, even things like hockey didn't seem to bring us together in quite the same way as it used to. And I think, again, to kind of go back to this note of vague optimism, the fact that we now at least seem to be coming to a consensus on some of these things, or at least not devolving into screaming matches, I think is a good sign. Now, we still have problems. We're facing a possibility of a referendum in Quebec, maybe another one in Alberta, and there are still definitely East-West divergences, English and French divergences, but I don't know, at least we're all watching hockey together again.
And gay hockey at that.
And gay hockey at that.
Brilliant. Well, I think that might be a good place to wrap up the conversation on the hopeful note. We do have one final question that we ask our guests, and what we're interested in is: do you have one source of data, or maybe vibes, data on our political culture that you follow, and that you think our listeners should be following too?
It's a vibes thing. And it's that people, at least based on the data that I've heard from every major institution in the country, is that people are going back to the mainstream press again. Listen, I'm in the mainstream press. We are not perfect. I'm never going to say we are perfect. But I think over the last number of years, people have, much in the same way, I think they've gotten bored of following a whole bunch of siloed and niche, cultural properties. The same way that people have enjoyed all watching the same thing again, which is Heated Rivalry, or the Olympics, or whatever, the same way that people enjoyed being in the same conversation again, I think people enjoy a world in which they have an institution where they can open up the webpage or pick up the newspaper or turn on the TV and just see the same thing that everyone else is. Whether or not they can have problems with it, they can disagree with it, they can not trust it. But the fact that we're all kind of maybe at least trying to get on the same wavelength again about what's actually happening in the world, that's a good sign, I think.
I feel like we just got 2 doses of optimism from a journalist, no less. So I'm feeling very inspired. Thank you so much, Justin.
Thanks you, Justin.
For having me.
It's time for Random Sample. In case you missed it last week, this is a data point that's been on our mind, and we think you should be watching too. Kyla, what do you got?
Well, I'm actually going to stick with the theme. So we spent the last hour or so of our audience's time talking about a show about hockey and the political implications of that show, not necessarily of the hockey or the sport itself, but about the off-ice relationship, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
But, the events of the past few days are a good reminder that sports are also, perhaps unfortunately, inherently political. If you missed it, obviously the president of the United States had made a pretty sexist joke about having to invite the women as well to the White House, which was a joke that got a lot of laughs from the men's team, which I think was just really unfortunate, given that the women's team is, of course, the more successful team under that program that has won more medals, performs tremendously. So I know that, in a post-Trudeau world, it's maybe no longer chic to be talking about women's representation, and we're no longer waving our feminist flags. But I think it's still needed in this space. In a 2023 RBC and Wasserman's The Collective study, they found that male athletes earn 21 times higher the salaries of professional female athletes. For example, the average NHL player makes $3.5 million, while women professional hockey players typically make between $35,000 and $80,000.
Wow.
Obviously, you can chalk this up to lower interest in the sport, right? This is a market. This is a private enterprise. But this is kind of a chicken or an egg situation. Only 5% of media coverage globally is dedicated to women's sports, despite 40% of participation being done by women and girls. Focusing on the PWHL specifically, obviously they're a very new league, but they've been really successful so far, are seeing a lot of growth. Year over year ticket sales from last year to this year is up 17%. And 60% of sports fans believe brands should increase their support for women's sports, and 40% are more inclined to buy from companies that actively back women's leagues. So if you have found yourself, disappointed in men's hockey maybe in the past few days, you're a new hockey fan. As we've mentioned, Heated Rivalry has kind of increased interest from women or people that are not typically that interested in hockey. I would recommend a PWHL game. They're actually extremely fun. The Ottawa Charge in particular puts on a really good show. The first game that I went to, I saw a little girl walking in with like a hockey jersey and a tutu, and I was like, yes, this is for me. I love this. The music's great. It's a good vibe. So that's my random sample.
Awesome. Thank you. My random sample this week is a paper out in the journal Nature recently. Nature, of course, one of the most prestigious scientific journals on the planet. Academics ran a real randomized experiment on X, the platform formerly known as Twitter. They paid about 5,000 American users to switch their feeds for 7 weeks. And half of the participants in the experiment got the standard algorithmic For You feed, and half just got a chronological one of people they were following. The results from this experiment, when they compared the two groups, the For You and the chronological feeds, are pretty striking. People who switched onto the For You algorithm, became measurably more conservative in their political views. They were about 5 percentage points more likely to prioritize Republican policy issues like crime, immigration, and inflation. They were 5.5 percentage points more likely to think that the prosecutions of Donald Trump were a political witch hunt, and 7 percentage points less likely to hold a favorable view of Volodymyr Zelensky. But on the other side, turning the algorithm off basically had no effect. So the damage, if you want to think of it that way, if you're a liberal, or maybe the benefits if you're a conservative, it was already done, because the algorithm had kind of already done its quiet nudging. So turning off the algorithm, no effects, but turning it on, big rightward effects. When the researchers looked at the content that the algorithm was promoting, they saw conservative content at roughly double the rate of the kind of the simple chronological feed, and almost 60% fewer posts from traditional news outlets. Maybe this kind of data is not surprising if you felt the vibe shift on X in the past couple of years since Elon took over. But the reason why this is such an interesting study is it is clear causal evidence that algorithms can be political actors, and the study finds pretty effective ones.
Yeah, super interesting. I mean, in the social sciences and when we look at political polling, a lot of the time, the data is descriptive, or you can see a correlation, but to actually be able to see something that is causal is it's pretty stunning.
Well, that's all for us this week. We want to send a big thank you to our guest, Justin Ling, to our future sponsors for helping keep this podcast free for you, and to you, our audience. I think we're building something really cool here. So thanks for being one of our OGs. Kyla, where can the people find you?
You can find me at Ronellenfitsch on all of the social media platforms, and Relay with Kyla Ronellenfitsch on Substack.
And I'm at Gabe Roche on all of the platforms. We will see you again next week. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Welcome to the Culture Lab.